So it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Jonathan Caulkins. He's going to be talking about market trends in high-potency cannabis products. I'm sure many people here already have heard and read the wonderful things Dr. Jonathan Caulkins have published. I've been his fan since 2014, always sitting in the first row and taking notes of everything. He is a professor of operations and research at public health and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University Heinz College. And you can read more about his bio in your package or if you're home online. Thank you very much and welcome, Dr. Caulkins.
Cool. Okay.
This is your one.
Thanks. Well, thank you for that introduction. I am thrilled and honored and really excited to be here today, but I should start with a warning. Sharon politely got up and said she's concerned about making you comfortable. I think my job is to make you uncomfortable. I am going to try to present data and ideas that will challenge things that you think you know about this topic, because that's the purpose of a gathering such as this. And in particular, I'm going to try to talk from the policy and societal level. There will be many speakers throughout the day who are going to do a fantastic job of explaining the laboratory science, and I'm going to stay more at the policy level with three main themes. The first thing I'm going to argue is that legalization, specifically legalization of supply by for-profit companies, as opposed to legalization of use, is a major driver of the spread of high-potency cannabis products. The second theme, though, is that I think legalization of commercial supply is a major driver of other important themes that are also threats to public health, and they are all wrapped together and at times are hard to sort out. And I want to say a little bit about some of those other patterns. Then in the last third of my remarks, I'm going to take legalization of for-profit supply as a given. And I'm going to take as a given that we think that the high-potency products specifically are a threat and ask what can one do about that from a policy perspective, and particularly entertain the idea of what would happen if some specific cannabis products were banned. And would that generate an illegal market that would eliminate the benefits of the ban and create the problems of illegal markets, because illegal markets are what fascinates me. So that's my agenda. And I want to point, is there a problem? So I want to start by pointing out the question that is not a policy question. When an individual chooses to use a regular cannabis product or a high-potency cannabis product, that's a tremendously important choice for them that can be directly informed by this fascinating scientific literature, but that's not something that policymakers or public health people get to decide. A thing that we do get to decide collectively as a society is, are we going to legalize a commercial or for-profit supply? And as I suggested, I think that's an extremely important choice with many ramifications, including the proliferation of these high-potency products. And what I'm going to try to do here for a few minutes is help you walk in the shoes of the companies that produce and sell cannabis products to understand why this change has the effect of expanding high-potency products. And the first observation is that legalization fundamentally changes the whole structure, performance, and conduct of the cannabis producing sector. The big myth with legalization is that it's going to be same old, just without arrest. If you go back 20 years, the typical cannabis producer inside the United States was growing 99 plants, because there was a federal law that kicked in at 100 plants, doing that in a warehouse or a storage container under artificial lights, which is totally crazy. No other plant-based product you buy at the grocery store is grown that way. We don't grow cucumbers that way. We don't grow tomatoes that way. That was a tremendously inefficient way of producing things. If you look north of the border, you see what it means to be efficient in the legal production of a plant that happens to be the cannabis plant. A typical grow facility there can be 1 million square feet. And grow masters there are not people who commune with the plant and talk to it in sweet tones to try to get it to flourish. They're often PhD agronomists bringing modern agricultural science to bear, and they are able to produce, and we also are able to produce, much higher potencies through better growing technologies and better strains. A second separate change is it okay to have an extraction machine on your premises? 25 years ago, if you had an extraction machine in your garage and the police knocked on your door, you had a difficult thing to explain. And that matters because a lot of the cannabinoids are not in the flower buds. The flower buds have the highest concentration, but most of the mass of the plant is in leaf and stem, and the lower concentrations of cannabinoids there in a bigger part of the plant adds up to quite a few of the cannabinoids. Just in round terms, let's say it's half and half. Before legalization, half the cannabinoids were unrecoverable. They were essentially just thrown out. Now, industry can capture those. And so industry wanted to change our consumption patterns from mostly flower to ballpark a 50-50 mix of flower and extract-based THC. And industry succeeded. So this is data from Colorado, the first 4 years after legalization. It's a little bit hard to read. The bars go up because that's total quantity going up. But the thing to focus on is what proportion of the bars are green, indicating flower, and it went from roughly 70% to roughly 40%. Similarly, data from Canada, in the 2 years after legalization, the non-medical market went from sort of 90% flower to 60% flower. So that's a second reason why legalization induces this change. Another is just legalization permits a proliferation of product forms. These days, the primary retail vehicles are stores or online plus home delivery. Either of those allows hundreds of different products. 30 years ago, when the primary retail mechanism was a retail drug dealer giving something to you, they could not carry 50 different kinds of flower and edibles and vapes and dabs and lotions in their trench coat pocket. So there is an opportunity to have a proliferation of products which include, not just, but include higher potency forms. And the fourth point here is, in some sense, the most important, and I'll return to it several times, which is that the strategic challenge faced by a legal industry is resisting the downward price pressure that comes from cannabis, basic cannabis, becoming a commodity. That's what would kill profits for the industry. How do you fight commoditization and downward pressure on prices? It's through product variety and differentiation. Some of that can be things like saying, oh, my cannabis is organic and the other stuff is not. Some of it can be, I have a wonderful terroir because it's Mendocino County cannabis. But it's also different kinds of products, different potencies of flower, but also these different forms as a way of fighting against that downward price pressure. We could go on, but the meta point here is the decision to legalize inherently builds into it a lot of drivers of the spread of high-potency products. Now, I do want to point out it's not only legalization. There's also been a trend towards higher potency in many countries that have not legalized. These particular charts come from France. We could do it with a dozen other countries. And this chart is what cannabis potency was doing in the United States before legalization. So real quick, look first at the two dashed lines. The top dashed line is the average potency in the United States of Sinsemilla. The lower dashed line is the average potency of commercial grade cannabis imported from Mexico. Both those lines went up somewhat. The blue line is the key. That is the weighted average for the US market. And you can see that fairly quickly from 2000 to 2010, the market shifted from mostly Mexican commercial grade to mostly Sinsemilla. So the actual average potency of what was being consumed, the blue line, really went up quite a bit, but then there was a step jump up with legalization. Those dots on the far right are Washington data from the first 3 years after legalization. So I'm not claiming that all of the trend towards higher potency over the last generation is induced by legalization, but I am claiming that legalizing for-profit supply is a driver of the spread of the products that we're talking about today. All right, now I'm going to make a second point. I believe that if we made a top 10 list of the biggest public health threats of legalizing commercial supply, unambiguously high-potency products would be on that top 10 list. But I am not sure it's number one or perhaps even in the top 5, so I do want to pause and make a case that there are other things that come with commercial legal supply that are of concern, and if you know me, you know I think about prices, I think about markets, and the change in prices has been really dramatic. So it's essentially an 80% decline in the price per gram before adjusting for the change in potency. All the numbers on this slide are going to be sort of high-grade cannabis, Sinsemilla products. This is my best numbers on the change in the wholesale price nationwide. Pre-legalization, we don't really have a good nationwide number, so I'm using California because that was the biggest market. 80% decline. These are the markets for this state, wholesale, essentially 80% decline. These are the numbers this state, retail, of high-quality cannabis, essentially 80% decline. When you include the inflation adjustment, if you look at the price of BC bud back in 2006, $40 per gram. It isn't that today. And this pre-legalization was, say, 14% THC product, now call it 21%, so 50% increase in potency. So an 80% decline in the price per gram without adjusting for potency translates to like a 90% decline in the price per milligram of THC. That's a big change. It is also not necessarily the end of the story. There will continue to be downward pressure on prices if we go to national legalization. Call the current price roughly $10 per gram. I don't think you can rule out the possibility that the production cost after national legalization could be down in the range of $10 a pound. 453.6 grams per pound, that's a factor of 100 difference. Now, I can talk for an hour for the detailed explanation of this, but here's the thumbnail explanation. You can get 1,000 pounds per acre from cannabis. It's a very productive plant. If you just go to your local state agricultural extension service and ask for the spreadsheets they offer to regular farmers of all sorts of other crops and describe what's the typical cost per acre of production, you know, tomatoes, maybe vaguely similarly difficult to grow, on the order of $10,000 per acre, do the math, that's $10 per pound. That's 2 cents a gram, that's a penny or two per joint, production cost. To put that in perspective, you know those little packets of sugar you get at a diner with your coffee for free? The wholesale cost of those little sugar packets or little ketchup packets that at McDonald's they just toss in, those are about 3 cents each. So we're talking about the cost of production getting down into the range, perhaps, of things that we give away in other contexts. A little bit like a bar will give away salted nuts to try to get you. That's a radical challenge to the industry in terms of maintaining its profitability, and it's a radical challenge to public health. But staying in the industry perspective, the cannabis industry post-national legalization will face economics that are a little bit like the Arrowhead bottled water industry, right? So the bottled water industry convinces us to pay $2 or $3 a bottle for something that's almost indistinguishable from a product that's basically free. And they succeed, but that's the challenge that they face. When you've truly got national legalization, large-scale modern agricultural production, that's the world that the cannabis industry struggles with. They have to figure out how to get you to pay what you're willing to pay, what it's worth to you, for something they can produce for a very low price, but so can their competitors. All right, I will stop about prices. I talk about prices all the time. Backing up, my thesis is that there are quite a number of different consequences of legalization that matter, and I'll mention just one more. I'm going to go with point 3 up here. So we all think, oh, marketing. Once the full shakeout in the industry happens and we go from little $50 million a year cannabis companies to national and multinational brands the way that we have in other consumer products, we'll have marketing. And we think, oh, okay, that will be marketing increasing sales to a product segment. Absolutely, it's point 2. But point 3 is sometimes overlooked, which is that when you have a large industry, it can act strategically to reposition a product in the social space. And I'll tell a story first from the tobacco industry, so Bia will appreciate this. Think about cigarettes in the United States in 1880. They existed, but they were almost not used. The tobacco industry back then, it was mostly selling cigars to men with local and regional companies. And then the machine-rolled cigarette was invented. It radically reduced the cost of production, very much as legalization has radically reduced the cost of production of cannabis. And after about 30 years, there have been consolidation into national tobacco companies that are successfully selling a lot of cigarettes to American men, especially after World War I. But that industry stepped back and said, women are not using our product. Let us consciously create a marketing campaign, not just to expand consumption for men, but to pioneer a new market with women. This is the Virginia Slims sort of campaign, and they succeeded. And you might say, oh, that's only the tobacco industry. That's only back in the 1920s. But no, this stuff happens all the time. This is what industries do. I had a conversation with a strategy consultant to the alcohol industry who told a story about American wine. In 1980, wine for Americans was something that was associated with meals. And that limited the wine industry's sales. And so they consciously said, how can we get our product to not be stuck in that niche of being something that's consumed with meals? And they thought, how about we make it something that's associated with fun and friends, and maybe especially women, because men already have beer for that space. And so there was a conscious effort with things like storylines in Hollywood movies to depict 30-something successful independent women having fun sharing a bottle of wine, not over a meal. And now in 2022, what space in our society does that product occupy? Wine is no longer confined to be something we think of with meals. Likewise, the liquor industry said, this is sort of circa 2000, I think, we don't have a presence at sporting venues. When people go to baseball games and football games, they're drinking beer, they're not drinking liquor. How can we change that? And they thought about it, and they recognized our product is associated with glass containers. What's selling at sporting venues is in cans. We have all these ideas from the Alka-Pop experience, which we couldn't actually do, but we can take Alka-Pop kind of products with fruit flavors, light, put them in cans looking like beer, put that in the stadiums, and now 2022, when you go to a baseball game or a football game, you can see that, and then that led to the hard ciders and seltzer world. So you have to recognize that when you have an organized industry that achieves scale economies that come from a national market, that is a consequence. All right, I'm going to stop. I won't go down the whole list of 10, but my point is high-potency cannabis products are a very important consequence of legalization, but not the only one. So if the public health community approaches Washington, D.C., as Washington, D.C. is contemplating national legalization of for-profit supply, this is sort of the message that we would deliver. We'd say, among the myriad things that you are thinking about, in this political process, much of which happens behind the scenes with lobbyists, please try to also remember that one of the consequences will be greater availability and use of high-potency cannabis products. True statement. It should be worried about. But I think they will also be thinking about social justice and jobs and taxes and impaired driving and. So that's my story on legalization as a policy choice. What I want to go to next is making the case that there have been post-legalization, post-reforms, other changes in consumption patterns that are concerning for public health, not just the high-potency products. And in particular, I note the changes in frequency of use and intensity of use, meaning THC per day. All right, so first, frequency of use. This is a very simple plot. It's just straight household survey data. How many Americans self-report use of a cannabis product in the last 12 months, normalized to make 1992 be 100. 1992 was the nadir of this. 1992 was the end of the 12 years of Reagan-Bush tough cannabis policies. That was the low point in modern cannabis use. Since then, the number of people who report use in the last year has almost tripled. Some of that is population growth, but there's also been maybe a doubling in per capita use. And if you say to the average American, would you be willing to have a doubling in per capita use in order to purchase getting rid of all of the costs and ugliness of drug prohibition in illegal markets, most people would say, well, yeah, that sounds like a good trade. But it looks slightly different if you ask about current use, meaning the past month use. Then we've got a quadrupling, and some people might say, that quadrupling is kind of a lot. And then if you say, well, what about the number of days of use? Well, the number of days of use has increased 7-fold since that nadir in 1992. And note, this is not just a step change the year after Washington passed its legalization. What I'm talking about is the change over this generation-long process of changing our attitudes and policies towards cannabis. Maybe you could take 1996 with the California law as time zero for this. But the public health interest is not even in days of use. The public health interest is first and foremost in daily and near daily users, and this is the line for the number of daily and near daily users. At the end of the 12 years of strict policy, it was under 1 million. Now it is over 12 million Americans who report daily and near daily use of cannabis. And that is because of one of these sort of repositionings of the product in its function in our society. This chart is showing the proportion of current, i.e. past month users of alcohol, bottom line, cannabis, top line, users who report using daily or near daily. If you go back a generation ago, cannabis was like alcohol. It was predominantly a recreational drug. It was something people did for fun at parties on weekends. Yes, about 1 in 10 people were using much more frequently. Many of them had some sort of substance use issues, but the great bulk of people were not using it daily or near daily. That has changed over the same period of policy liberalization. So now fully 40% of current users report report using daily or near daily, much more like the pattern for cigarettes. Let me do these exact same data. This is proportion of past month users. Now I'm going to change the vertical axis so it's total number of users. Different look at the same basic phenomenon. Back in 1992, if somebody said, I want to talk to you about Americans' daily and near daily use of a dependence-inducing intoxicant, you said, oh, you want to talk about alcohol. Because the vast, vast majority of daily and near daily use of a dependence-inducing intoxicant was alcohol. Today, if you want to talk about Americans' daily and near daily use of a dependence-inducing intoxicant, it's like, well, that's about half alcohol and about half cannabis. That's a major change. And it fuels where the money is made in this market. One of my favorite little pop quizzes, and Jillian, you can't answer because you've heard this before, is if you think from the perspective of the industry, what proportion of your sales are to adults with no substance use disorder issues at all, not only no cannabis use disorder, but also not alcoholics and so on, and using fewer than 10 days a month? That's a weird metric. I'm looking for weekend-only use. The data don't tell me whether they used on Tuesday or Friday, but less than 10 days a month is my proxy for this is somebody who's using only on weekends. How big a share of the market is that for the industry? And typical answer, people say, oh, it's a third, it's a half, maybe it's 70%. No, it's nothing. It's like 2.5%. It's that little tiny gray wedge. Adults with no substance use disorder who use fewer than 10 times a day don't matter for current revenues for the industry. They matter a lot for political cover. They do not matter for today's revenues. Kids are also not driving it. Kids are the wedge at the bottom. There are a fair number of under 21-year-old users, but they tend not to be using intensively. It is daily and near daily users who account for 80% of the sales. The big block on the right are daily and near daily users who report enough problems to meet the criteria for substance use disorder, and then the big block on the left is the daily and near daily adult users who do not. So that's part one of this story of another change. Cannabis use is now much more frequent. It's also more intense in terms of THC per day. So this is my image of the prototypical cannabis user way back in the year 2000. I hate being so old that way back is something that I remember. Back then, you think about somebody who used every weekend night, but not during the week, and we'll say it's one joint. That could be one joint by themselves, or they share 2 joints with a friend. 0.4 grams per joint, 4% THC potency. Do the math, it's less than 5 milligrams per day of THC on average. What is the math for daily and near daily users today who are consuming 1.6 grams a day on average of 20% THC? It's 320 milligrams per day on average. That is a 70-fold increase in average THC consumption. Now, I do want to point out, that's not just a change over time. I'm going from the typical user in 2000 to the typical use session in 2022. And you can ask, are there any important behavioral health consequences of a 70-fold increase in dose? And, maybe not. The human body is really pretty amazing. There is this phenomenon of tolerance. We can get used to things, and maybe the people who are using 70 times as much function just as well in society. They've just adapted to this. But sometimes the dose makes the poison. So by a weird coincidence, the same numbers apply to cocaine. So down in South America, indigenous communities have been using the coca leaf to make coca tea. It functions in society there very much the way tea does in the British Empire. And the amount of cocaine molecules that you consume when you have a cup of coca tea is less than 5 milligrams. I I was part of a group at RAND that also estimated total cocaine consumption in pure metric tons for the United States, as well as estimating the number of frequent users. And unfortunately, it was work for ONDCP. We had to follow their language. Their language was chronic users. I don't like the term, but it's frequent users. And you do that math, that 327 metric tons divided by 3 million chronic users, 290 milligrams per day, about a 70-fold difference. And now ask, is there any important behavioral or health difference between having a cup of coca tea per day or consuming cocaine at the intensity of chronic cocaine users in the United States? And I think there might have been. Not to be hypocritical, I also like to look at my favorite drug, which is Diet Coke. And usually at this point, I hold up my bottle of Diet Coke, but in deference to Seattle, I have my cup of coffee. But 76 milligrams per day is my normal daily dose, and I can ask, what would it mean for me to increase that dose by a factor of 70? And it would mean drinking 35 grande Starbucks cappuccinos every single day. Now, I realize here, you're like, yeah, that's what we do here. But in the rest of the country, people think that's a big increase. And in many other parts of the country, they would say there might be a behavioral or a health consequence of that much caffeine. But it's not even just the drug. Like, I like blueberries, okay? And so that's a normal dose of blueberries. What does 60 or 70 times as many blueberries look like? And would there be any different behavioral or health consequence if I increased my blueberry consumption by that much? And I'd have a bellyache. So sometimes dose makes the poison. And the grand experiment that we as a society have embarked upon is finding out whether or not this substance, which was basically harmless at 5 milligrams per day, remains harmless at 300 milligrams per day. And the jury is still out. But one of the great things about our being here today is that we collectively are going to learn a lot about that question from the speakers who come later and are far smarter than I am. All right, so I told you I was going to try to do 3 things. I was going to tell you that legalization brings high-potency products to the market, that legalization has other important impacts on consumption patterns, but now I want to turn to this question of, suppose we take legalization of for-profit supply as a given, and suppose we take as a given that the high-potency products in particular are an important concern. Then what? And I think there's a set of policy implications that are terrifically important but are dull. Remember, I said I was going to try to make you uncomfortable, so this is being intentionally provocative. When I say dull, I don't mean they're not important. When I say dull, I don't mean I don't support them. I just think they're no-brainers. Do we want good labeling? Well, yeah. But I would want good labeling even if I wasn't singularly concerned about high-potency products. Would I want good education and prevention programs? Well, yeah, but I don't only want that because I'm concerned about high-potency products. Do I want good data collection? Yes, there's a whole bunch of very important things that we should be doing, and if concern about high-potency products motivates us to do these things we should be doing anyhow, I'm all for it. But what I want to take the last part of my time to address is what I think is a more difficult question, which is this issue of product bans. Banning a particular class of cannabis products, like banning waxes and dabs or banning vaping, banning flower that is above a particular potency cutoff. And in the Netherlands, there was a big discussion about that, around a 15% cutoff for a number of years. And we could also talk about taxes. Tax is tremendously important. I love talking about it. But I think for broad purposes, the way you think about very high taxes is sort of similar to the way you think about a ban. If the tax difference is modest, then it is not a major concern. But if the tax difference is big, then it almost begins to operate like a ban. And the central question I want to address is, would product-specific bans create illegal markets for those banned products that would undercut the public health benefits that were aspired to and also create these other problems? Because it's some some people will say that vetoes the whole idea. Now, there will be an illegal market anytime illegal producers can make money net of or enough to compensate them for their risk of enforcement by selling that product at a price point that induces consumers to choose that illegal product over the legal alternatives they have. That's basically how markets work. Whether or not there is that possibility for a win-win partnership between illegal producers and consumers who are willing to purchase that depends on a whole long list of factors. Notably, it depends on how much enforcement pressure is brought to bear on those illegal producers. If one were to not place any enforcement tax on them, then of course the illegal production is going to happen, because producing in an unlicensed and unregulated way will always be less expensive than producing while following the rules. And that's not primarily because of excise taxes. That's the red herring. It's because of all the other things. If the legal regulated producers withhold payroll taxes and the illegal cheaters don't, the cheaters have an advantage. If the legal folks have to follow all the other rules and the cheaters don't, the cheaters will have an advantage and they will be able to thrive. I mean, one of my favorite anecdotes comes from here in the state back in '93 when I was part of Mark Kleiman's team trying to help out LCB, and I was interviewing this sort of gray market medical producer who wanted to move over into the legal regulated space and was complaining about all the regulation. And it's like, do you have any idea what honest business people have to put up with? And of all the things he could have complained about, he said, they're asking me to put in ramps in my greenhouse so the greenhouse is ADA compliant. It's not excise taxes. There's a whole bunch of things that give the illegal producers an advantage unless there is some continuing enforcement to prevent them from undercutting the licensed, honest, regulated industry. At any rate, you can tell, I can talk about this slide all day long. The point is, it's a case-by-case thing that depends on what thing you're talking about banning and all of the economics around it. But I'll put up 3 hypothetical scenarios to lead to the general point. Imagine that the country banned all vaping products. That would produce some public health benefit, but I do think that would also create an illegal market. There would be production in Mexico and Canada, movement across the border by organized criminal activity that would then be sold. It's an open question whether or not that size illegal market would more than offset the public health benefits. I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. If anybody would like me to fund me to study it, I'm happy to do it. But I do think there would be an illegal market there. Now, suppose Washington State alone banned vaping products, but Oregon said, we're open for business, we're going to sell these. I believe that some of those vape pens would make it across the state border, but I don't think that would predominantly be done by criminals carrying semi-automatic weapons. I would suggest thinking about that the same way that fireworks crossed state borders 25 years ago, when it wasn't only Massachusetts that banned personal fireworks. I grew up in upstate New York. New York was a state that at that time didn't allow personal fireworks, but many people vacationed in North Carolina and Virginia. And that's the sort of illegal market I think you would have. It would undercut some of the public health benefits, but it wouldn't be a particularly destructive illegal market. Suppose Washington State tried to ban flour that was more than 25%. My guess is that would not create much of an illegal market. I think most people who want a high-potency flower would say 24%, and the convenience of buying at a legal store is good enough for me. So take those 3 cases and now lay them out on the basic analytic framework that should inform decisions of ban or not ban a product. You would like to be as far to the right as possible on this diagram. Left to right increases public health benefit. You would like to be at the top of the diagram. Going from top to bottom increases the size of the illegal market. I think those three things that I just speculated about might fall effectively on the diagonal. The bigger reach on the public health side, the bigger the risk of an illegal market. And so in some sense, our collective enterprise is to ask, are there any things in the upper right-hand corner where you can get a big public health benefit without much of an illegal market risk? And I think that's a very interesting discussion, and I will look forward to being involved in it. What I won't stand for, though, is somebody who just says bans of products always fail. That is just false. It's observably false. Here is an example of a U.S. prohibition, a product ban, that has not generated a large illegal market. Many people know this, but we have a prohibition in this country against walk-behind rotary lawnmowers that do not have a dead man switch. That was put in place in 1982. You have to have positive control such that if you're not actively saying I'm engaging it, within 3 seconds the rotor stops. That does increase the cost of production, so there is room for a potentially illegal market on people selling walk-behind rotary lawnmowers that do not have a dead man switch. My city is not plagued by organized crime, drive-by shootings driven by that illegal market. That is a product ban that works at achieving some public health safety benefit without inducing an illegal market. Here is another prohibition in our country that you may not have realized. In Europe, you can buy chocolate candy eggs that have little toys in them. It's sort of like the Cracker Jacks box, but in chocolate. Those are banned in the United States. The specific language is we may not have confections with non-nutritive objects in them, pure bureaucratese. When my kids were young, our neighbor across the street was a pilot for US Airways. He would fly over to Europe and bring back these Kinder Surprise candies, and my kids were delighted. So there was illegal activity at some level, but it was like that cross-state borders for fireworks. He was not carrying a semi-automatic weapon as he did that. I have made reference to fireworks. It's in part because I spent the last year looking at the history of prohibitions of fireworks and the related illegal markets. I think it's a highly relevant example for us today because there's a direct analog to potency. The short summary is that the United States went through first free markets, then prohibition, then legalization of personal fireworks, very much the way that we did with cannabis, just a little bit earlier. And ironically, there are other parallels, like the number of emergency room mentions per hour of use is spookily similar for fireworks and for cannabis. But to oversimplify, there was this 1966 Child Protection Act, and then there's some other things too. It didn't all happen instantly, that took a market that had previously had highly potent fireworks available for general use, up to 3,000 milligrams of black powder, and put a potency cap of 50 milligrams. And what happened? Well, as I suggested already, there was a lot of informal cross-state line trade in federally legal consumer firework products that generated no big crime issue, undercut some of the benefits. There is also an illegal cross-international border trade with products over 50 milligrams produced in Mexico and brought into the United States by criminal organizations. It is not a multi-billion-dollar market, but there is a little bit of that. Despite those market evasions, unambiguously, the number of injuries, especially the number of eye injuries, did fall with the prohibition. That was the impetus for the prohibition back then. And with the relaxation, as I said, all but one of the US states have now relaxed these rules. There's been a commensurate increase in use of these fireworks and an almost completely parallel increase in the number of eye injuries. There are examples that are more relevant to us from the alcohol and tobacco space. Absinthe, for instance. That was a spectacularly successful prohibition for almost 100 years in the United States and many other countries in the sense that there was no big illegal market for absinthe. And the reason was people who wanted to consume absinthe had the opportunity to consume many close substitutes of other kinds of hard liquor. That might have been a pointless successful prohibition because the fears of absinthe being uniquely threatening were mostly unfounded, but it's a demonstration that a product ban does not always produce an illegal market. The ban on caffeinated alcohol, I think, is an interesting one. It is defeated by do-it-yourself at home, rum and Coke, but it has not generated an illegal market. The ban on flavored cigarettes, terrifically important. My read of the literature says, broadly speaking, this has reduced youth smoking. There is not a large illegal market in flavored cigarettes. What is the policy topic of the day is extending that ban to menthol, and also possibly banning just plain nicotine cigarettes. I think both of those are very high stakes decisions. There is a possibility of an illegal market there. Now, I could go on. My last example I'll mention, because I love it, is lawn darts. 2 weeks ago, I got to go to the Museum of Failure. I highly recommend you going to it. It's just a wonderful description of all the failed products. I found out that one of my childhood joys was in that museum. They were banned in 1988. I do not know of any organized crime groups that are trafficking in lawn darts. I do note that YouTube does have do-it-yourself instructions for how you can fabricate in your own home a lawn dart that is just as dangerous as the one that I played with as a kid. Okay. Oh, and I guess the Montreal Protocol, important because unambiguously there is a substantial, serious criminal illegal market in chlorofluorocarbons, but almost everybody thinks the benefit in terms of protecting the ozone layer exceeded that cost. Okay. In summary, when thinking about product bans, you're basically balancing public health benefit against the risk of illegal markets. That is the framing to look at it, but absolutely not responsible to say all product bans fail. It is false to say all product bans create illegal markets that undercut all the public health benefits and create big problems. I think we're in a new space in cannabis. I'm not exactly sure what bans work best. My suggestion to policymakers is for sure use this tool, but to paraphrase the harm reduction literature, start low, go slow. Find those products which are particularly egregious and which have a relatively small customer base as your starting point. That may be a small public health benefit, but I think there's low risk. As we gain experience with what does or does not work in terms of product regulations and bans in the space, maybe we'll be able to expand from that and reach that upper right-hand corner of nirvana. Apologies if I've talked too long. That's my fault as a professor, but I hope it was a little bit informative, and thanks for listening. Do we have any time for questions? Or? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Does that work? Hello? Hello? Does the microphone work? Testing? No.
I could repeat the question if that would help.
That would be great. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. Thank you so much, Dr. Caulkins. That was fantastic. What a great presentation. I have a ton of questions, but I'm obligated to share others. If Washington were to implement a medium risk, like X medium reward policy, such as banning all vaping products, how would the illicit market be affected if Oregon implemented a comparable policy a few years later?
So the question is, what would happen if Washington implemented a ban on vaping products? Oregon did not initially, but then it followed later. And so I love the question. And so my guess is that while Oregon was legal and Washington was not, you'd have that informal cross-state sort of fireworks style thing. But the question is, if Washington leads, how do other states react? And there's an interesting calculus here because on the one hand, The rest of the states might say, inspired by Washington's wisdom, we will come along also, and then eventually you get to a nationwide ban where you would expect there to be substantially less use of vaping pens, because although there could be an illegal market in them, you'd expect, prices to be higher, lower availability. There's a lot of people who are just honest and wouldn't participate in it. So that's one story. The other possible story is the people down in Oregon would say, suckers, we'll take your tax revenue. The 50 states are a laboratory of democracy, but they grow states big out here. I think if we ask the question in the Northeast, I know the answer better, and the answer in the Northeast is some small state would say the benefits for us of collecting tax revenues on sales to all of the other big states around us would make the temptation too great. The West is a little different because states are bigger and you have fewer instances of major population centers on the other side of the border. I don't know. I think it's a close call. It's a great question.
So we have another question. This one comes up often. So on the slide showing the number of daily users of cannabis, almost catching up with the number of daily users of alcohol between 1975 and 2020. And actually, I'm going to ask if you can forward a little bit. I want to make sure people at home can see how to ask questions.
Sure.
There.
So,
one back. There.
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
So does that pattern suggest a possible change in the use away from alcohol towards cannabis? And would you say that that's harm reduction?
So the question here is the big expansion in daily and near daily cannabis use coming at the expense of alcohol, so they are substitutes? So this is like the billion-dollar question, both from industry perspective and public health perspective, is does the expansion in the supply of cannabis affect consumption of alcohol, also tobacco, potentially other substances, and if so, in what direction? I have often been quoted as saying that I think 25 years down the road, when our children and grandchildren judge us for what we did on cannabis policy now, they will judge us based on how it affected alcohol abuse and tobacco consumption. They're not going to care only about the cannabis-specific outcomes. So the short answer with alcohol is the literature is more or less divided straight down the middle. There are a large number of studies on this very important question. And I will add that, there are plenty of studies that allow anybody who wants to cherry pick only from one side or the other. That is, there's a set of studies that say they're substitutes and the expansion in cannabis supply has reduced alcohol use. For every one of those, there's a study that said the expansion in cannabis supply has increased the amount of alcohol use. I think it's one of the most important policy questions out there. I'm a little pessimistic that even the smartest scientists in the world will be able to answer that today because we haven't yet legalized cannabis. I mean, I know Washington has, but the other Washington has not, and that matters. And furthermore, even after national legalization, it will take 20 years for the industry to fully mature and for all of the changes to play out. So I think we should study it like crazy now, but no matter what we find, based on data to date, I think we should remember the future is very hard to predict. And I think it's an open question. On tobacco, the story is mostly bad news. On the tobacco side, the literature is less divided and it's bad news. Increasing cannabis supply tends to increase tobacco smoking. For instance, there's studies that suggest that tobacco smokers who are also smoking cannabis have more difficulty quitting tobacco smoking while they continue cannabis smoking. But absolutely fantastic question.
I think we have time for one more.
Okay.
Has there been data on black markets for flavored vape products in municipalities that have bans?
I am not aware, I'm sorry, the question is there data on the size of illegal markets for flavored vape products in municipalities that have banned them? I am not, I do not know of them. I think, again, it's a lovely question, and it may well be that there are states and localities that have some data on that, and if you do, I really want to hear about it. Here is my guess. When a municipality implements a product ban, that's even more vulnerable to the informal cross-border smuggling as if a state implements the ban. So cannabis products are mostly not perishable. Cannabis products are also very light. A daily cannabis user who consumes 1.5 grams per day consumes over a year material that weighs the same as one 20-ounce can of beer. Cannabis can move across borders pretty easily, so my guess is if it's only a municipality doing the ban and the municipality next door has not banned it, the consumers in the place with the ban will still have pretty good access. But I would really love to see that addressed with data.
I lied. We can do one more.
Excellent.
And there's a lot of great questions, by the way. Have you seen a change on how the cannabis industry is shifting their marketing to include new markets, similar to what you described for alcohol and tobacco? And is there a way to create a policy to slow or prevent advertising?
The question is, has the cannabis industry already been changing its marketing practices, including trying to pioneer new markets in the way that I alluded to with tobacco and alcohol? And if so, can policy stop it? The short answer is, I think we've seen some steps in that direction, but the big steps will wait for there to be large enough corporations to have a strategic interest in changing the whole market. If a market is made up of 100 small and medium-sized companies that are, 50 million in sales or below, they don't individually have an incentive to spend the money to change the way that the whole society acts, because the benefit of that would be spread across all 100 small companies. That sort of strategic repositioning of products is more likely to happen when there are a smaller number of very big companies. The second half is, can policy stop it? And the short answer is no. We have a First Amendment freedom of speech protection that the Supreme Court interprets as applying to commercial free speech. So short answer is no. This country cannot do it. Many other countries around the world that are excellent democracies with a lot of freedoms are less committed to commercial free speech than we are in the United States.
That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.